right, up for today's gear review is a Pioneer QX747A quadraphonic stereo receiver. These were manufactured between or somewhere around 1976 or 1977. 20 watts per channel in quad, 40 watts per channel in stereo. Dimensions were flash, weight was flash. These are kind of heavy. They're kind of big. They're kind of really wide, I guess is a better way to look at that. Series information. So there were lots of quads that were going on with Pioneer between, let's say, 73-ish and 77-ish. So in 1973, with the QX747, now this is the 747A, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The top of the line in that product catalog was the QX9900 and or the QX949. I'm not sure which one would be considered top of the line between those two. In 1977, the top of the line was the QX949A. Now, in the earlier product catalog, as far as quad receivers go, you had a 4000, a 646, a 747, a 949, and a 9900. By the time 1977 rolled around, the two quad receivers that I found in the 77 product catalog were the 747A and the 949A. For those that are unfamiliar with quad, it's kind of like a precursor to surround. Didn't last, right? Some people really like it nowadays. There are like 2 or 3 people that come into 402 vinyl that really, really like quad, but that's only 2 or 3 people. Most people that run these run them in stereo mode. I have found when I had my 949 for a long time, I ran it in stereo mode. You know, aesthetically, these are just cool. I just love the way these look. I love the meter, right? I'm sorry if you are a photosensitive viewer and I've got the bouncing Miller light balls potentially in the background, and you've got the VU meter flashing and, you know, all of its goodness. So there's that. Sorry, I'm just checking, make sure my microphone, I'm using my wireless lapel mic, so I want to make sure it was recording. So these are just cool. The meters are neat. You definitely get, this is a combination of kind of the design from the X3X series and the X2X series. So for example, these little flanged potentiometer knobs are definitely from the 727s, or not 727s, the X2Xs. The dial glass is probably a little more consistent with an X3X, X2X, kind of the same thing. Some of those parts may or may not be interchangeable in terms of knobs, but I'll talk about that when I talk about what to look for on these. The sound of these is unique and it is sweet, and I love the sound of these quads in 2-channel stereo mode. The best way I can describe them is they are very warm. They're very consistent with the X2X and the X3X, right? I find those to be a little more on the warm side and a little less on the punchy side, right? Or the clear side. Definitely more of a cap coupled vibe, but I wouldn't go so far as to say this sounds anything tube-like. But again, it's so subject to my ears and speakers, and you know, it's just hard to really quantify that. But these sound different to me. They've all sounded different, and that's why I like them. I think that's in fact due to the matrix or decoder board that the signal passes through. It mellows that sound out. At least I've read online that that's what causes these to have that unique kind of warm sound. But again, I think it's pretty consistent with the X2X and X3X series receivers. Power, 20 watts per channel in quad, 40 watts per channel in stereo, as I mentioned. Hookups, I'm just going to say they're complicated. Now, someone commented on my 949 product review, and they said they're not complicated if you read the service manual. That is a true statement. However, they're not as easy as a normal stereo, where you only have, hey, tape in, tape out, phono, auxiliary, right? Here, your speaker hookups, normal stereo, left, right, positive, negative, maybe 2 sets of speakers. This you've got front and rear, and which do you use and what do you not use, and is it channel 1 or 2 or 3 or 4? That's more so on the 949. But yes, if you review the manual, it's easy. But if you're just Joe Blow stereo person, you know, no one has time to read the manual. I'm sorry. People just don't do it. So it's complicated. It's not intuitive. Maybe a better way is to say it's not intuitive. Operation can also be a little complicated. It's not intuitive. So the way the controls are laid out, you have your really cool VU meter. You have front. So if you're running these in stereo mode, you use the front speakers. So you have two separate balance controls for either channel, or for all channels really, but specifically running it in 2-channel. So this is the, I'll do this one. This is the balance control. See how that left VU meter goes down, right? That's the balance control for the left stereo channel, right, left quad, right quad. Power. It's got an orange little button there, a center on the button there, so it's easy to identify. The cool thing about the levels is you can, attenuate them. So if you really want these to bounce, you press both of these in for a total of 30 decibel, kind of muting on that, so you can see them a lot better. Speaker connect or speaker controls. All speakers are off naturally because I'm not listening to this through any speakers. Right, and then you have front A and B. That's going crazy. Two tape monitor buttons, one for 2-channel, one for 4. A Dolby noise reduction adapter, loudness control, FM muting, the dial control. CD4 separation. I mentioned CD4 separation in the 949 video. There were a couple of competing types of quad at the time, right? I think this helps with channel separation front and rear is what I believe that does. A couple of headphone hookups, bass for the front channels, bass for the rear channels. Excuse me while I walk in front of the unit here. And then we have the mode 2-channel, 4-channel RM, or 4-channel CD4, 4-channel RM, and 4-channel SQ full logic. I believe what's going on with these is CD4 and RM, those are two flavors of 4-channel stereo. I think SQ full logic, I'll have to look it up. I'll flash up on the screen exactly what it is, but I think it's maybe where this thing tries to create its own, its own quadraphonic sound. I'm not sure, but I believe that's what it's doing. It may be a third variation, but anyway, I'll flash up whatever that is. And then finally, you have your function, AM, FM mono, FM auto, phono, and auxiliary. You do have, 2 tapes. You have 2-channel and 4-channel. I'm not sure if you can hook up a 2-channel to the 4-channel. That may be only for 4-channel quad reel-to-reels, but I am not positive. Serviceability on these things, I'm just going to be honest with you, they're advanced. They're kind of a nightmare. And the reason why I say that is there are a couple things you need to be aware of. Number one, these are full of known bad transistors and known bad or failure-prone capacitors. There's a service video on this one, and to summarize what happened here, I took this in to troubleshoot low output on one channel. So as I was what I thought was repairing the low output on that one channel, I found that there were basically every single blue Sanyo cap in this thing was out of spec, and all but maybe 3 or 4. And once I got that sorted out, I had less bass on one channel. So I went through and I talked to the owner. At first I didn't want to spend any money on this thing, and then at the end of the day, they came into the shop. We gave them credit for this towards a new receiver, and then this became a 402 vinyl project, and I just recapped the entire thing. So I had to work on this whole thing. Normally I can recap a receiver in probably, and this is with adjustments and all that stuff, probably less than 3 hours. So let's call it less than 3 hours. This one took me about 5. Now, the reason why it took me 5 is because of the sheer number of bad transistors in Sanyo caps. And what was really aggravating was the cap failures went beyond the sky blue Sanyo caps. There were so many other capacitors in the signal path, especially on the matrix or decoder board, that I ended up I had to replace them all. So it wasn't a Sanyo cap that was causing the low bass output on one channel. It was actually just a regular old electrolytic capacitor. So it was completely like a shotgun repair because, the problem is if you know that those Sanyo caps are bad, does it make sense to try to troubleshoot it when you know that any one of those 50 blue caps can be causing your problem potentially? It doesn't make sense, right? So you kind of start at a baseline. That's how I approach, and I replace all those. So anyway, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but it's a pain in the butt to work on. You have to disassemble the heat sink and getting to the amplifier board. While not super tricky, it takes a good 10 to 15 minutes to just disassemble that to where you can get it to the point where you can replace the caps and the transistors on that particular board. The other boards aren't too bad, but you have a lot of wires that wrap to the boards, and you can't like flip the board up because there's a wire that's preventing it. So what I wound up doing was I would just remove the wire wraps from the boards to get them to a point where I could easily access the fronts and backs. And part of the reason why it took me so long was, unwrapping a board's wire wraps without damaging them or cutting them is time consuming. And the whole thing was just time consuming. So serviceability, bad Sanyo caps, bad transistors, bad other transistors, bad just about everything in this potentially. And then it could be a nightmare to service. And I think the non-A version is even worse because you have more boards. So if you're looking at picking one of these up to potentially either use or repair or whatever, what are some things that you need to look out for? Again, I always start with cosmetic completeness. You want to make sure all of these knobs are there, although the knobs are probably easy to find because I think you can easily swap an S or an X2X knob in here. You want to make sure all these cap covers are there. These are different. So for example, although these knobs here look as though they are the same as these, they're not. These are longer, these are shorter. So you have to be careful if you want to if you have to replace one of these or one of these. Now, since these are longer, you can replace them with a shorter one, no problem. But since these are shorter, right, in depth, if you replace it with one of these, it sticks out pretty far. So you have to be aware of that if you come across one of these with those knobs missing. You have to get the right knob, basically, for those. And these cap covers, those are probably on the easy side to find. The dial meter, or the dial display tuning knob is probably easy. Sorry. And this tuner is really good. Again, no antenna in my basement. Picking up a stereo signal that's a good tuner. It's a very good tuner. I don't know how many gangs it is. I was gonna look, but I didn't. But it's a good tuner. So completeness. One additional thing that I would encourage you to check is make sure that if there's an image or if there's something that talks about the meter operation, I would make sure that the meter is illuminated, that it's bouncing, right, like this, or there's some indication that it's working. So replacing the lamps on these can be kind of a bear. You have to get the lamps aligned just right, or if they're not positioned right, the illumination of the meter behind there doesn't illuminate right. So basically, you'll get kind of uneven meter display. So I would definitely look for that. In addition, I would look for information on repair or service history on it. So I've ranted before on eBay listings where something has been serviced. Well, what does that mean? Does it mean you just wiped off the front and squirted some deoxit or fader lube on the pots? Or did you go in and remove all the dozens of bad capacitors and transistors? Or was it recap? Like what do you have going on? So I would pay attention and ask questions regarding the service history, right? Especially if it's on the higher end in terms of pricing, right? You don't want to buy one of these and overspend and then have to go take it to a tech who's going to spend 3, 4, or 5 hours and literally dozens of capacitors and transistors later, and you could be looking at a $500, $600 bill potentially, depending upon who's doing the work. And this is time consuming. This took me a week. I don't have a lot of time currently. I've got about an hour a day, but it took me over a week, and that's like an hour a day, or well, maybe an hour a day. So I definitely look for that, and then service history. So price on this. What might you expect to pay? As of today, when I did my research, there was no There were only about 6 747s that sold, and I could not determine if they were 747s or 747As. Now, what's the difference between the two? Let me just kind of take a little bit of a detour here. In looking over the service manual, it appears as though with the A variants of the 949 and the 747, I believe some of the functionality or circuitry, maybe is a better way to put it. Some of the circuitry was combined onto boards. So on the 949 or 747 traditional, the decoder and the matrix board would be separate. On this one, they're combined. So the boards have different numbers. When I first started poking around in this, I pulled down the service manual for 747, and I'm like, none of the boards are aligning to this. The board numbers are off, and they don't look the same, and the components aren't jiving. So I had to pull the 747A, and that's where I found that this was the A variation or the variant. So I believe that's probably the main difference. There could be other differences. I'm not a historian on quads. I'm sure someone will probably have some information and they'll chime in eventually. But that was the big thing that I noticed from the technician's perspective, right? All I know is the boards didn't match the service manual for the non-A variation. So this is a 747A, and just it looks like maybe they changed some of the transistor types in the 747A versus the 747. But, you know, you never know. Manufacturing substitutions happen all the time, so you don't know. So going back to price. So looking for one of these to pick up. So let's start with one that's in really good cosmetic condition, similar to this one that's been recapped. Today when I looked, again, I could not tell if it was a 747 or a 747A. I recapped example of this sold for north of $350. Now, I would say that for the A version, you can probably add another $50, maybe $100 to that price tag, because I think from what I saw and the components that were used in these, they may be a tad more reliable. There were fewer bad transistors than the 747 manual made me believe there were initially. The Sanyo blue caps are consistent throughout both. This had fewer bad transistors. So whereas I probably replaced 40 or 50 or maybe even 60 blue caps, I probably only replaced 20 transistors. But looking over the service manual for the 747, it looked like it was going to be probably closer to like 30 transistors. Not a huge difference, but those are transistors you have to dig out and replace, right? So I think, again, maybe plus 50 bucks. So let's assume that, and let's say $400 or more for one in this condition. This is almost perfect cosmetically. It's a little bit dusty on the top. There are no issues. Everything works exactly as it should. It's been recapped. It's dialed in terms of DC offset and bias. This thing is good to go for another 20 years. All the pots were clean. This whole thing was disassembled, right? Yeah, so this would definitely go out at, $450. Probably not as high as $5, maybe as high as $5. It just depends. But again, for one that's good to go for another 20 years, totally worth 450 bucks. One that's working, right around the $300 mark, I would say. So if you get one that's working, that's been serviced. So let's define service. Maybe the bad transistors and the bad caps were replaced, but it wasn't a full recap. Or maybe you have a low hour version of one of these that was stored properly to where the transistors aren't going bad and the capacitors, right, they have a lot of life left. Although, the capacitors just dry out after time. But let's just say you have an anomaly where there are no issues with it. 300 bucks, right? Probably $300. One that's not working, one that has an issue, right? So like this one, when this one came in, it had a channel imbalance, it had weak base, it had all these other things, it had all the bad caps. I personally would never spend more than $100 on one of these. Maybe what I saw on eBay, about 150 bucks. I would never go as high as 2 on one of these. So this would be the exception to the add $50, right? Because there's so much work involved. And, especially if you have to sort out, one of these knobs, or these knobs would be easy, but maybe one of these button covers or something like that. The 949 that we got at the shop, we didn't even put 100. We didn't even. I think it was less than $100 because they're horrible to work on. Right. By the time the shop pays me to go through this and do it, and they get a very deep discount on these things in terms of my work. There's not a lot of room on them. There's not a lot of room on them because you can't charge an exorbitant amount on this. So again, if you're looking to pick one of these up where you are going to try to fix it, I would not spend much more than $100, especially on a non-A, right? On a non-A variation. But it's man, if you get one of these dialed in and working, they just sound so sweet. I mean, they sound really good. They're very, 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 very nice sounding receivers. Very nice sounding receivers. So I think that'll wrap it up for the QX747A. Beautiful receiver. I just love this. When I had my 949, I would turn the lights off and just let that thing bounce while I was listening to music on it. It was really something special. So if quad is your thing, or just the way this thing looks is interesting to you, I wouldn't shy away from one. So as always, if you like what you see, like, hit subscribe, and I'll catch you all in the next video.